Welcome to the Indian Council of World Affairs, India's oldest foreign policy think tank.
Many people interested in foreign policy have told me when they come to the Indian Council of World Affairs in Sapru House, they feel a great sense of affinity with this institution because this was where the serious study of international relations in India all began.
The ICWA was set up by a small group of public intellectuals some years before our independence, because they felt it important that India have an independent perspective on international affairs. Since then, the ICWA has gone from strength to strength, and it has been a long journey, almost 75 years. One particular milestone in that journey was in 2001, when the Indian Parliament passed an act declaring the ICWA to be an institution of national importance. We thus became a publicly funded independent think tank. Our governing council is headed by the Vice President of India, and the External Affairs Minister is its Vice President. We have three focus areas. The first is research, which is carried out by an in-house faculty. Very rigorous research of different parts of the world, encompassing the domain of area studies.
The Council has been very proactive in conducting dialogue and discussion on African affairs and India-Africa relations in order to promote an understanding on African affairs in India, an Indian perspective on Africa, given the priority that now Africa has in Indian foreign policy.
Within the Council, we have a renewed focus on Latin America and the Caribbean region. So we're looking through our studies to find new areas of cooperation such as renewable energy, climate change and the space technology.
Interacting with leading experts, diplomats, media persons and academicians has helped me nurture my research further.
We recently had the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlook, which has a lot of convergence with the India's own Indo-Pacific construct.
The learning curve at the Council has been tremendous, and it provides a strong foundation for my future research.
The second is policy. Because we are a think tank, and being close to policy, commenting on policy, and helping formulate policy is an essential part of our functioning.
I think in the new age, what we're seeing much more of is that people want to be involved in foreign policy thinking. They want to have a voice. Now, this is where ICWA comes in.
This is the platform where I, for many years, have come and interacted with the best in the world.
ICWA provides a valued platform for visiting foreign dignitaries to interact with informed Indian audiences. The third is outreach. This is most important because of our role as a public-funded independent think tank, and we carry this out by associating ourselves with as wide an audience in India as is possible. Colleges, universities, other think tanks, and of course, with similar institutions elsewhere in the world.
What I would call the democratization of Indian foreign policy. It has moved to distant corners of the country. It is no longer a preserve of Delhi.
ICWA has a robust publications program which includes papers by the in-house faculty, invited papers and commentaries, and books on foreign affairs by not only former diplomats and established academics but also by upcoming scholars. Our journal, India Quarterly, is being published since 1945. ICWA's publications are also being translated into various Indian languages. What is ICWA's role as we move into the future? The vision of the institution is to stay abreast of all the momentous changes taking place in the domain of foreign policy. New areas are emerging. There are strategic technologies, there is climate change, there is artificial intelligence, and there is cybersecurity. How can our research faculty and the audiences that come here be better informed about developments in these areas? How can we write and formulate research papers to give policy inputs that help in government policy formulation? These are the emerging challenges for ICWA and form a part of our vision for the future.
A very good morning. Happy Gandhi Jayanti. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the second day of the two-day international webinar on Gandhi and the world, organized by the Indian Council of World Affairs, New Delhi, India's oldest and premier foreign policy think tank. Yesterday, we had an extremely constructive and illuminating discussions, conversations, and presentations on Gandhi's impact on his contemporaries, on various geographies, and his social and political ideas and its importance today. We will start our discussions today with the second part of panel 2, themed Gandhi and the World, Different Geographies. The session will be chaired by Mr. Ashok Malik, Policy Advisor, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. Our first speaker in the panel is Dr. Raj Sekhar Basu, Professor, Calcutta University. He will be speaking on Gandhi and the indentured labor question in the Pacific, the Fijian story. Our second speaker, who will be joining us shortly, Mr. Maung Maung Oo, scholar from Myanmar, will be speaking on Gandhi and Myanmar. Our third speaker, Dr. Sandagomi Coperahewa, Professor, University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, will be speaking on Gandhi's ideas on language and its influence on language policy making in Sri Lanka. This will be followed by a brief question and answer session. I would take the opportunity to mention some house rules. All speakers and panelists are requested to mute themselves when not speaking. Questions will be taken during question and answer session. Panelists can ask questions to the speakers live through raise hand option. Questions can also be asked by registered attendees live by typing through the chat box. These will be visible by all panelists. Questions may be kept brief and to the point. In case you are facing connectivity issues, you may switch off the camera and continue on audio mode. I would now request Mr. Ashok Malik to conduct the proceedings. Thank you, sir. I think Mr. Ashok Malik has got disconnected. We'll wait for some time for him to connect back. Sir, please conduct the proceedings, sir. Thank you.
Yes. My apologies. I went off for 2 minutes because there was the traditional, unlike the Mahatma, we need to manage with electricity, and it decided to go off at just this moment. So my apologies to all panelists and to ICWA. My name is Ashok Malik. Good morning. I'd like to thank ICWA for giving me the honor of chairing a session which is so important and so appropriate on Gandhi Jayanti. Gandhi Jayanti greetings to all of you across the world. Thank you, Dr. Raghavan. Thank you, everybody at ICWA for inviting me. This conference has been devoted to really Gandhi and the world, and I'm reminded of my previous job, which was in working for the President of India's Secretariat. In early 2019, we were planning for the President's state visits to Chile, Bolivia, and there was a third country in Europe, which I think Croatia. So while planning for Chile and Bolivia, was speaking at universities. The president was speaking at universities in both the countries, and we gave the university authorities a set of topics, 3 topics each, which they could choose from, and the president could speak about the relations between India and that country, either Chile or Bolivia, in the context of that chosen topic. And am I audible? Great. So what struck us as, and the topics were quite wide-ranging. They spoke about India's economic and developmental both challenges and progress. They spoke about the state of the world. They spoke about India-Latin American relations. There were several topics there. In the case of Chile, there was something about the Pacific community, because the Indo-Pacific community, which unites both Chile and India in different parts of the world. The topic of Mahatma Gandhi and his relevance to today's world in his 150th year was also part of the mix. It was part of 5 options I think we sent to each university. Lo and behold, both universities got back with only one option. They wanted a speech from the President of India on Gandhi and the world and his relevance to the relationship between India and either Chile or Bolivia. We did try to dissuade them, because for the President to give 2 very different speeches, because obviously he couldn't repeat himself, on essentially the same theme, Gandhi, within 2 days of each other, was difficult, and it was much more challenging for us in the Secretariat, because we would be preparing the first draft for the President. But both the university in Bolivia and the university in Chile would have nothing of it. They said, no, it is either Gandhi or nothing. There's no question. We only want to hear about Gandhi. And that was, one more evidence of the fact that Gandhi is just so important and such an ambassador for India and in the Indian ethic, really, across the world. Across geographies, even as far away as South America, where they connect Gandhi to their own liberation movements, some of which actually preceded Gandhi in the 19th century, and their own movements for a fairer, more equal and just society, which run in parallel with Gandhi and continue to this day, well after Gandhi. This is something we see in geographies across the world. Public figures as different as Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Lech Walesa, Václav Havel have alluded to Gandhi, referred to Gandhi, seen him as an inspiration. Of course, he remains very relevant to India, though sometimes we tend to be, in our public life, amnestic almost about Gandhi. I am reminded of a cartoon by R.K. Lakshman, perhaps the greatest Indian cartoonist, or newspaper cartoonist of our age. This cartoon appeared just after Richard Attenborough's film Gandhi was released, and it showed 2 politicians walking out of the theater which was showing Gandhi, and one tells the other, very moving film. I understand the story is true. So, but while our politicians are what they are, but in real life, in movements as different as a movement for justice for a young woman who has been brutalized, in a movement for a more equal language policy, in a movement like the Chipko movement in our country for ecological balance and for just protecting trees, Gandhi is alluded to. Gandhi wrote nothing about gay rights, but gay rights, the gay rights movement has also adopted Gandhi. Gandhi is the small who is universal. He is universal not just across themes, also across geographies, including 3 geographies that we are going to be discussing in today's session. 3 intimately connected with India, 2 are neighbors of India, India's closest neighbors in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And one, of course, is Fiji, which has a large community of Indian origin and has again had a long and a very intimate relationship with India. The speakers today are Dr. Raj Sekhar Basu from Calcutta University, which is also my former university, my alma mater. Dr. Maung Maung Oo from Myanmar, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. and Dr. Sandagomi Coperahewa from the University of Colombo. Again, a country I'm very familiar with and have a great affection and love for, especially I must say for Sri Lankan food. Let me start by asking each of the speakers to speak for about 15, 17 minutes, and then we'll go into a discussion and a question and answer session. So, Professor Raj Sekhar Basu, if I could ask you to begin and speak for about on Gandhi and the indentured labor question in the Pacific, the Fijian story. So much, Dr. Basu.
A very good morning to all of you. Let me begin by thanking Dr. Raghavan and ICWA for inviting me to be a resource person in this seminar on Gandhi and the world. And also a very good morning to Mr. Malik, the chair. Now, as you all know, that I'm going to speak on Fiji, and it's quite a longish paper that I wrote on Fiji, which is my field of research at the moment. Now, on 15th January 1920, Indian laborers employed in the Public Works Department in Suva, the capital, decided to go on strike. And a few days later, they were joined by the Municipal Council laborers. And the next day, the strike spread like an inferno. And the majority of the Indian laborers and Indian peasants who were employed in the lands close to the sugar mills owned by the Colonial Sugar Refining Company, which was an Australian company, also expressed their sympathies for the strike. The sugar-growing regions in Nabua and Levuka were also affected. However, the impact of the strike was mostly felt in the Suba-Rewa region, where there was a large concentration of Indian population. As we all know that we have these two main islands in Fiji, and we are just going to talk about these islands. The colonial bureaucracy, obviously perturbed by the strike, decided to report this incident to the ruling groups in Australia. And in a cable message which was directed through to the Prime Minister of Australia, through the office of the Governor General in Canberra, the Governor of Fiji observed, and I just read out some of the cable versions. All Indian workers are still out at Suva, Rewa, and South Coast sectors. They made no demands before striking, and it was only last week that they submitted a statement of their grievances by deputation to me. I thereupon appointed a commission on inquiry into the whole question of wages and high cost of living, which should have actually reduced the trouble. The commission had been welcomed by the public generally and by the Indians who are selecting representatives to give evidence and preparing statements. Agitators have been trying to extend the strike to the sugar centers in the North Coast and the West Coast, but the Colonial Sugar Refining Company has made a substantial offer of increased wages and price to the Indian laborers and growers. I have not yet heard whether this has been accepted. Large number of Indians in Suva and Rewa are out unwillingly, but others encouraged by the strikers are preventing them from resuming work by intimidation. As we all know that this is a sort of a version which is an official version which obviously implicates the Indian laborers for taking part in strikes for nothing. Interestingly, a series of strikes took place in Fiji, as we are going to discuss in a few minutes from now, involving a large number of workers, as we have just described, working in the sugar mills and ordinary peasants with small leaseholdings. And these incidents have some direct and indirect connections with developments that were taking place in India at this length of time. In fact, these strikes had much similarities with the agrarian disturbances and peasant unrest that had affected large parts of modern-day Uttar Pradesh, then referred to as the United Provinces of Agra and Awadh, and Bihar. The majority of the Indians who had migrated to Fiji after signing the bonds of indenture belonged to the Bhojpuri-speaking tracts of eastern UP and the contiguous districts of western Bihar. Some of the Uttar Pradesh districts like Gonda, Basti, Azamgarh, Faizabad had frequently been categorized by the colonial officials as impoverished territories which threw out a lot of migrant laborers. It was therefore natural that these districts would have long embedded histories of migration and displacement because people left the villages in large numbers in search of jobs in the Assam tea gardens, the Calcutta jute mills, and also went as far as Mauritius and to the sugar colonies in West Indies in search of lucrative employments. However, this territorial affinity does not fully connect the developments that took place in India and Fiji in 1920-21. In both India and Fiji, what needs to be understood is that low wages, high costs of living, influenza epidemic had taken havoc in the lives of the laborers and the peasants. The peasant insurgency in eastern UP, which gained ground because of the changes in the pattern of agrarian relations, high living costs, and a greater reliance on commercialization of agriculture, did have a great deal of commonalities with the experience encountered by immigrants in rural Fiji. But there was another side of the story which linked the developments in the eastern United Province districts and the contiguous districts of Bihar with the situation in Fiji. Gyan Pandey, in his researches, has clearly shown that one of the most influential leaders of the Awadh Kisan Sabha was none other than Baba Ramchandra, a Maharashtrian of uncertain antecedents who had been an indentured laborer in Fiji and thereafter had remigrated back to India. Before being lured into the task of organizing the Kisan Sabhas, Baba Ramchandra had been a wandering sadhu, a religious mendicant propagating Hindu scriptures in Jaunpur, Sultanpur, and Pratapgarh. Indeed, it goes to Ramchandra's credit that he was able to convince Jawaharlal Nehru, who was still to become a leader of the Congress, to really understand or comprehend the problems faced by the Indian peasantry and the raging fire that was prevailing in the countryside. Now, I was interested in actually building up a narrative based on the developments which were taking place roughly at the same time, 1920-21. This attempt is nothing but to draw an analogy based on developments that were taking place in two different parts of the globe, separated in territories in two different parts of the globe, separated from one another by 15,000 kilometers. And this would reveal several other issues which are normally not accorded that much of importance by historians and social scientists. In contemporary times, when there is a move on the part of the academia to prioritize transnational history or histories, there should be attempts to take up different stories and experiences linked to the bigger narratives of peasant, of the subaltern consciousness and the autonomous agency that goes in the building and sustaining of popular movements from below in the tropical parts of the British Empire. Now, all through, as we all know, that throughout these, whenever we come to the North Indian side of the story, both Ramchandra and Gandhi to the peasants had acquired godlike status. The imagined versions of their personality resting on the premise of the on the vilification of their on the sort of the deification of their status led to a lot of stories and rumors. And rumors actually circulated about the multiple personae of these leaders. This sort of reverence from Gandhi emerged from their own cultural world and made them think that the Mahatma exercised considerable influence over the government and the native landowning groups. But the reality was a lot different, which was time and again overlooked by the rebellious peasantry, who displayed an uncritical adulation for Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi, rather than siding with the peasants, was very critical of the incidents that involved the peasants, particularly the looting incidents, and tended to avoid all direct contacts with leaders of the Kisan Sabhas during his visit to the region. He did warn that if the peasants did not follow his methods and accept the Congress and the Khilafat injunctions, he would not tolerate them. What needs to be remembered is that Peasants Gandhi was not a remote Western educated lawyer politician. He was a Mahatma, a Pandit, a Brahmin, and even a merchant who lived in Allahabad. Now, in the case of the Fijian strikes of 1921, These were also led by some men and women who identified themselves as followers of Mahatma Gandhi and who took to this entire task of mobilizing the cane sugar mill workers and the ordinary peasants. And then they tried to vindicate the fact that they were indulging in such activities under the instructions of Gandhi, who had already started a movement against the colonial bureaucracy in India. The first major strike in Fiji was led by Jayakumari, a Satyagrahi activist who had been trained at Gandhi's ashram in South Africa in Phoenix, and her husband Manilal Doctor, an Indian barrister who had come to Fiji with Gandhi's blessings. The second was led by a sadhu by the name of Vashisht Muni, a religious mendicant who presented himself as a follower of Gandhi. Now, these people were mostly involved in mobilizing the peasants and the laborers with raising demands for, raising demands such as increase in wages because of food shortages, high prices of cereals, lentils, and other items. The institution of commission did not lead to, sort of negotiation. Rather, it led to more violence and the death of one of the workers. The roots of the strikes lay in the peculiar conditions that prevailed in Fiji during the post-First World War period. The sliding of economic fortunes of Indian laborers in Fiji was indeed the most important reason behind the strikes. Contrary to the opinions which had been expressed by the governor, these strikes had hardly to do with racial violence or foments from outside by people who had their own vested interest. It needs to be remembered that even if Jayakumari and Manilal and Vashisht Muni might have invoked the name of Gandhi, there is hardly anything to prove that they were involved in supplanting the Gandhian non-cooperation movement in Fiji. It is clear from the official records, as well as from their own assertions, that despite their closeness or proximity to Gandhi, they were interested in building up a movement against the sort of injustices that the Indian laborers were facing, particularly denial of some basic entitlements. However, these motives in course of time came to be believed by the striking masses as acts which had the sanction of Gandhi. This was evident more during Sadhu Vashisht Muni's campaign in Fiji, when in his own rustic way, he tried to interpret the grievances of the Fiji's Indian laboring masses in terms of the Gandhian critique of colonial capitalism. Vashisht Muni tried to prove that colonial capitalists were greedy and depraved individuals who had diluted the dignity of the Indians by initiating unequal wage systems based on racial distinctions. Interestingly, the striking workers and peasants carried these interpretations further, leading to occasional bursts of violence, skirmishes, and protests, which sometimes moved beyond the Gandhian principles of ahimsa and satyagraha. Historians like Margaret Mishra have argued that the intervention of Jayakumari Manilal and Manilal Doctor were essentially middle-class political initiatives and had little space for subaltern militancy, though both the husband and the wife as couple or duo threatened the fabric of the colonial order. Their politics remained much different from those of the indentured women who had a distinct subaltern essence. Mishra argues that these distinctions are very crucial and they are very much manifested in the way the colonial state interpreted them. For the colonial state, imprisoning the best way to deal with the subaltern women who were accused of disrupting law and order was to beat them up and to put them in jail. But for Jayakumari, she was rather let off, and her husband Manilal was deported to India for organizing protests and strikes in Fiji. Interestingly, the narratives on subaltern women who acted as peasant volunteers during these movements are missing in the researches of most Indian scholars. But the Fijian story is important as it has strongly asserted that the fight against economic oppression was inseparable from the battle against colonialism and patriarchy. But then there was but there were also use of religious slogans in Fiji, making it not very different from the contemporary situation in Awadh. Of course, Baba Ramchandra had argued even in the 1930s when socialism, peasant socialism was at its height in UP and Bihar, that why is the Indian peasant talking about class? They should actually, in the 1920s, we gathered so many of them when we were protesting against the British Raj in the name of Sitaram. Now, Sitaram could be interpreted very, very differently. Sitaram could be a code word for a meeting. Sitaram could have a religious flavor, a religious connotation. But here also, sometimes, at least during Vashisht Muni's campaigns, we find that there was this the usage of terms like Sitaram and Ram and Ram Rajya and so on and so forth. But then you see the sort of the religion, the invocation of religious verses and phrases that was quite evident in the case of the United Provinces was not that much evident in the case of Fiji, because Fiji had always witnessed, and still perhaps there are a lot of career diplomats who know much better than me, that in the Pacific, particularly in Fiji, there is a long history of tussle between the Sanatan Dharmis and the Arya Samaj. And when Vashisht Muni was actually there, he was in very bad terms with an Indian leader who had been nominated to the Fiji. He was the first Indian leader, I believe, to be nominated to the Fiji Legislative Council by the name of Badri Maharaj. And Badri Maharaj was dead against Sanatani Dharma. He was one of the leading figures of the Arya Samaj, and so on and so forth. Now, let me, since time is very short, and Mr. Malik would obviously remind me, let me just read out some of the sort of conclusions that I may have for this discussion. Now, I would argue that this discussion on the developments in Fiji, particularly Jai Kumari's incident, Manilal Doctor, and Manilal Doctor had gone to Fiji from Mauritius, accompanied by his wife. And when they became involved with this sort of strike, and this strike actually brought out a very different side of the story, when one sees the colonial intelligence reports and so on and so forth, and the European press actually gunning for the lives of Manilal and Jai Kumari, it becomes, it is really one side of the story. But when you really talk about Gandhi wrote a very, very moving passage when Manilal Doctor was deported from Fiji back to India, and he had to come back with his wife and 2 young children. Gandhi said, what harm has Manilal Doctor and Jai Kumari done? The fact is that they had been talking about people's rights. They had been talking about some issues where they're not talking of dismantling the empire. They're not talking of destruction of the British Empire. They have not resorted to any sort of violent techniques. So, as a lawyer, Gandhi tried to argue that this was not there in the empire's code of law or legislations, that a person who had protested against the injustices would be thrown out within a couple of days. The same thing happens to Swami Vashisht Muni. Now, Vashisht Muni goes to Fiji a few months later after Manilal has been deported to India. And Vashisht Muni, nobody knows that what actually Muni did in India. I'm trying to trace, but it's really getting to be a problem. I'm not getting the sort of information from the Indian side about what Vashisht Muni's antecedents had been. But somewhere or the other, all these people, who migrated to Fiji from the United Provinces, there is some bit of connection with my own city, that is Calcutta, because most of them went through Calcutta, went through the depots in Calcutta. And Vashisht Muni and we in Calcutta, Bengalis have had a very long relationship of love and hate with Benares, with Jaunpur, with Allahabad, and with Azamgarh, any part of this Bhojpuri-speaking region. And Vashisht Muni actually spent some time in Calcutta. That is what the Fijian records are saying, that he spent some time in Calcutta, and then he took a ship, he took a boat, and he went to Fiji. And after landing in Fiji, the sort of very interesting work that he does is he goes to the homes of the peasants and the laborers who are affected by the strikes, and he actually interviews them. And he asks them that Has there been any leader who has tried to organize them? Now, the peasants are very forthcoming, and they say, yes, we had a person called Manilal Doctor and Jaikumari. The women also talk about Jaikumari. And they said that they had tried to mobilize us, but somewhere or the other they have been deported. We don't hear about them anymore, because these are very ordinary people. These are semi-literate, or they are not literate people. They thought that Manilal and Jaikumari had been, kept out of these areas only for a short period of time. They will come back and once again they will lead them. But after 2 months, they realized that they had been sent back to India. So there was a great deal of despair and lull. And when they start talking to the Swami is actually in an orange dress. He's dressed like a saint. And Vashish Muni immediately seizes the opportunity and he says that I am a Gandhi Vakt, I am a Gandhi devotee, and I have come to you as an emissary of Gandhi. And he goes around, he tries to rally the peasants, he tries to talk about Sadbhavna, he tries to talk about, he raises this issue of Samaj, he raises this issue of Samta, and so on and so forth. And particularly if you find that, very close, the sort of similar thing is happening when one reads, Gyan Pandey or Shahid Amin, when they talk about this Eastern UP and how they look into Baba Ramchandra and several other itinerant groups of sadhus or sannyasis. And the British government is actually perturbed, because anything to do with crimson or anything to do with orange and anything to do with the sadhu is in the radar of the colonial intelligence, and they start writing a series of letters. They don't send letters to India, but they are in touch with Australia and New Zealand, because during the first strikes they brought in an entire contingent of Australian troops to Fiji to fire upon these innocent Indians, kill them. They also raised a special constabulary of Polynesian guards in Fiji to beat up the Indians, because they could actually talk about race and divide the Polynesians and the Indians and indulge in violence. The same sort of thing was repeated in the case of Sadhu Vashish Muni, that any gathering which was there, and a lot of people gathered in a small place like Fiji. If you had a gathering of 2,000
Dr. Basu, I'll have to ask you to finish.
So, 2,000. So there also we find that force. But what actually sustained a lot of stories about the subaltern women, that they threw excreta on the colonial police. That's the reason why the Australian force actually fired on these innocent laborers. But a lot of people, including an American anthropologist, has raised the question: why say all these things? After all, Jaikumari was raised in Phoenix. She had her instructions from Gandhi. She had received her part or instructions from Gandhi about non-violence. And how could she actually be a person who could instigate these women to throw excreta on the colonial official? But one thing which is there is that whenever you talk about these men and women who represented themselves as small peasant republics in Fiji, you can't always, and this sort of adulation and veneration for saintly personalities, are they acting as messiahs against all injustices? You can't really keep yourself away from the sort of sacrifice that was done by the women. This was one big issue. And you have and in the colonies, whether you go to Suriname, Mr. Malik was alluding to the president's visit to these countries. I was there in Suriname when President Ramnath Kovind was in Suriname. And once again, these two words, Nirbhay and Bharosa, undoubtedly these ideas have a great deal of importance. They have a certain millenarian favor, which has always been represented in the peasant world as Ramrajya, and had much to do with the ruralized version of Ramayana, where the author Tulsidas makes Ram a very, very ordinary man. But what I think has kept alive the people in eastern Uttar Pradesh, and also the people in the colonies, particularly in Fiji, is, I end with one very short verse. तुलसी भरोसे राम के निर्भय होकर सोए अनहोनी होनी ना होनी सो होए Tulsidas believes in Ram. Sleep with no distress. What is impossible will remain impossible. What happens will happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Basu. That was absolutely fascinating. You've captured many strands of Gandhiism, really, which actually mirror the Bhojpuri experience with Gandhi, as you said, or the Awadhi experience with Gandhi, uh, where there is a religious strand, there is an anti-colonial strand, there is a workers' and rights strand, there is a proto-feminism as well, which can't be explained. Just it was organic to Gandhi's work and activism and philosophy. And of course, there's an early socialism as well. We see many strands combined, and again, like today, everyone can interpret Gandhi, and everyone can see a bit of their own internal philosophies in Gandhi. Which and what is really fascinating is that people move from Mauritius to South Africa to Fiji, and of course from India and Calcutta to Fiji with Gandhi's message. Sometimes without having even met Gandhi. And that this happened 100 years ago at a time before email and before technology makes it even more impressive. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. And we move now to Dr. Maung Maung Oo, the scholar from Myanmar, Gandhi and Myanmar. Dr. Maung, it's over to you. Is he here among us? I can't see him on my screen.
Yes,
Good morning.
Good morning. Very good morning to all. I'd like to make a brief presentation on Gandhi and Myanmar. An eye for an eye only answer, making the whole world blind. In a gentle way, you can shake the world. The weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attitude of the strong. Above mentioned sentences are some of the famous quotations of Mahatma Gandhi. Today, the 2nd October 2020 is the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. It is also the day of International Non-Violence Day. Mohandas Karamchand, known as Mahatma Gandhi, was an Indian lawyer, anti-colonial nationalist, and political ethicist who employed non-violent resistance to lead the successful campaign for India's independence from British rule, and in turn inspired movements for civil rights and freedom across the world. Mahatma is a Sanskrit word meaning great soul or venerable. Gandhi's birthday, 2nd October, is commemorated in India as Gandhi Jayanti, a national holiday, and worldwide is commemorated as International Day of Non-Violence. Non-violence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. It is the mightiest weapon devised by ingenuity of man. Whatever Gandhi said. On 3rd October 2017, the United Nations observed the 148th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi as the International Non-Violence Day. Gandhi understood non-violence from its Sanskrit root ahimsa. Ahimsa implies total non-violence, no physical violence, and no passive violence too. Gandhi translates ahimsa as love. Non-violence was not Gandhi's invention. He is, however, called the father of non-violence because he raised non-violent action to a level never before achieved. Gandhi objects to violence because it perpetuates hatred. Gandhi feels that violence is not a natural tendency of humans. It is a learned experience. Perfect weapon to combat violence is non-violence. For Gandhi, non-violence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. It is mightier than any weapon of mass destruction. It is superior to brute force. In his autobiography, Experiments of Truth, Gandhi explained that ahimsa is the basis of the search for truth. As the world's pioneer in nonviolent theory and practice, Gandhi unequivocally stated that nonviolence contained a universal applicability. Gandhi emphasizes the power of nonviolence to emancipate spiritually and physically. It is a science and on its own can lead one to pure democracy. Gandhi visited Myanmar 3 times, in 1902, 1915 and 1929. In Myanmar, he delivered 12 lectures at different places like Yangon, Phnom, Moulmein, Taungoo, Mandalay, etc. During his meeting, he was pleased to see many Punjis, Punji means Myanmar monks, and Burma brothers and sisters, along with Indian brothers and sisters. He appealed that Punjis to remain pure beyond suspicion and also asked them to maintain stainless purity also with wisdom and ability. In all his speeches in Myanmar, he stressed on ahimsa. For Gandhi, ahimsa was one of the active forces in the world. For him, strength of ahimsa is much greater than the strength of millions of suns put together. For him, ahimsa is precious, even more precious than the gems and diamonds. In the views of Gandhi, if the sun dispels darkness, ahimsa radiates life and light and peace and happiness. In his speech to the students in Moulmein on 12 March 1929, he condemned idleness. According to him, those who believe in the teachings of Buddha will never remain idle, even for a single moment. In this meeting, he appealed Burmese youth to maintain purity of heart. He continued that if the Burmese youth maintain purity of heart, if they wanted to become the guardians of the purity of every girl and woman in Burma, then they must purify their hearts first. He expressed his anxiety on the increase of revenue on liquor in Burma, which ultimately indicated increase in consumption of liquor in our country. He also appealed people to uproot this evil habit. He asked to use the weapon of non-cooperation against such wrong deeds. Our great leader, the Nobel Peace Award winner, Aung San Suu Kyi, is an inspiring embodiment of Gandhi's maxims, such as strength comes not from physical capacity, but from indomitable will. Aung San Suu Kyi used Gandhi's ahimsa non-violence doctrine in her famous struggle for democracy in Myanmar against military junta. Thank you. And due to prior commitment, let me leave the meeting, please, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maung. That was very interesting and fascinating on how Gandhi's visits to Myanmar, Gandhi's precepts and mantras of non-violence influenced Myanmar itself, and how he continues to be so well remembered there. I now turn to our third speaker, Dr. Sandagomi Coperahewa from the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka. Gandhi's ideas on language and its influence on language policy making in Sri Lanka. Sir, what you will say will no doubt be very, very relevant in the context of Sri Lanka, but frankly, it is something which we in India too would find of great resonance, because these are issues and debates we have in our own country in our own way as well. Over to you.
Yes, very good morning to all of you. Greetings from Sri Lanka, Ayubowan. Good morning. Mr. Ashok Malik, chair of this session, and my good friends from India and from other countries. I would like to happy to see you all in this webinar, and thanks to ICWA for inviting me for this webinar, and also unfortunately we were not able to meet physically, but thank you for organizing this meeting virtually. My topic that I'm going to discuss with you is on Gandhi's ideas on language and its influence on language policy in Sri Lanka. I would like to share my presentation now. Give me just 1 second to share my presentation.
You have to use the share screen option, sir.
Yeah. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, we can, sir. We can.
Yeah, just I'm trying to put the slideshow. Yeah, just give me 1 minute. Yeah. Hope you can all see my screen. Hello.
Yes, sir, we can see it.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much again. I would like to share my thoughts on Gandhi's ideas on language and its influence on language policy making in Sri Lanka. I'm a linguist by training, and also later work as the founder director for the Center for Contemporary Indian Studies in Sri Lanka. I would like to focus mainly, first focus on Gandhi's visit to Sri Lanka, and then I would like to discuss the Gandhian impact of, especially on his ideas on the question of national language in the Svabhasha, or the what you call the own language movement in 1920s and 30s. And I would like to show the kind of Indian connections and context on the issue of national language, and especially very common to India as well, and how this Gandhi's idea of common language, or maybe a kind of a universal language, influenced the leaders of the Ceylon National Congress to adopt a single only language policy for independent Sri Lanka, that is in 1956. But what I want to do is to locate the country's language question within a wider discourse of language politics in India. And I would like to highlight that the slogan of in 1950s, this one official language, had a significant links and ideological connections with the Indian national language movement, and also with the Gandhian idea of common language. This is a verse written by a very famous poet. He was a Tibetan monk called Mahinda, S. Mahinda. In 1930, in a poem book written by Reverend Mahinda in 1930, it's called Nidahase Mantraya. It's kind of about the independence. This poet says to Sinhalese readers, I quote, this is a translation from Sinhala: he rose like Nehru, Patel and Gandhi, day and night fighting to make India free. My Sinhalese brothers to their words give ear, work for your nation's island, now come near. So this is one of the very famous poem written by Mahinda, and this shows in 1930s the influence of the ideas of Gandhi and Nehru and Patel. And what is interesting is, in 1927, Mahatma Gandhi and his wife Kasturbha Gandhi arrived in the island on November 12, 1927, A few hours before, the Lord Donamo and Lady Donamo, on the invitation of the Student Congress in Jaffna. So the Donamo Commission was at the top of the country's political agenda in 1930s. The invitation from the Student Congress Jaffna sent to Gandhi to visit Sri Lanka. During his tour, Mahatma Gandhi toured the island extensively from Mathare, that's in down south, to Point Pedro near Jaffna in north, and addressed many gatherings in Colombo, Kandy, Galle, Kurnagal, and also in Jaffna. These are the few pictures of, hope you can see, but not the resolution is not much clear. That's his visit to Colombo in 1927, and few speeches he delivered in Colombo and Jaffna in his visit to Sri Lanka, or in Ceylon at that time in 1927. Just I move to the question of language, the Gandhian view on national language. Commenting on the question of national language, Gandhi pointed out the idea of common language, but maybe the scholars may argue on this for India. I quote Gandhi, "If we are to have a common language for cultured India, we must arrest the growth of any process of disintegration or multiplication of languages and scripts. We must promote a common language." This is 1925. So Gandhi was indeed favor of a kind of linguistic unification, of kind of idea of a linguistic order for India. So he believed that a single national language would keep the country together and unify. So this idea of establishing a single national language for a country has often been critiqued as a deriving from a Western monolingual model of nationhood. However, the Gandhi clearly accepted that the argument from our past history, I quote, our past history, for the necessity of a lingua franca to strengthen the central government of the country. These are the ideas that he expressed on the question of language. And Gandhi believed that the following should be the requirement of a national language. Number one, it should be easy to learn for government officials. Number two, it should be capable of serving as a medium of religious, economic, and political intercourse throughout India. Number three, it should be the speech of the majority of the inhabitants of India. Number four, it should be easy to learn for the whole of the country. Number five, in choosing this language, considerations of temporary or passing interest should not count. This is, I quote from Young India, appeared in 1925, August 27. In his opinion, English did not fulfill any of these requirements. On the other hand, it was Hindi which could fulfill these five requirements, and no other language could compete with Hindi in the respect. Gandhi, in his address to the Gujarat Education Conference in 1917, had stressed the need of a national language and expressed that Hindi is the only language which could be adopted as a national language because of this is language spoken by the majority of Indians. That is in 19. I quote from the India of My Dreams, published by the Navajivan Publishing House in 1947. So as early as 1917, the Gandhi persuaded the Congress to accept Hindi as its official language. Gandhi said, I quote, "Until all public activities take place in Hindi, the country cannot progress. Until Congress conducts its all activities in the Rashtra Bhasha, we shall not obtain Swaraj." Close quote. However, the later Gandhi argued that the future national language, but Gandhi's ideas on language, there was a kind of some change. Gandhi argued that future national language of India should be in fact Hindustani, the commonly shared co-Hindi and Urdu that was spoken in the north of India by both Hindus and the Muslims, and written either in the Nagari or in the Persian script. In 1927, I just move on to again to the Sri Lankan visit. In 1927, at the time of the Gandhi's visit to Sri Lanka, the question of language in education was on the political agenda of the Council of Ceylon, Legislative Council. That was a time that there was a lot of reforms on education on debate in the Legislative Council. Various education commissions and legislations recommended the maintenance and the use of vernaculars or the local languages alongside the colonial language. Influenced by the Indian freedom movement and the Gandhian ideals, Tamil politicians and members of the Jaffna Youth Congress, this is very important to look at how the Jaffna Youth Congress in North took the lead in agitating for the use of mother tongue in education. So this was a period in 1927 when Mahatma Gandhi visited Sri Lanka, when the Jaffna Youth Congress took the lead in agitating for the use of mother tongue education. The initiative to invite Gandhi to visit Sri Lanka was taken by Handi Peribranayagam on behalf of the Jaffna Youth Congress. So referring to question of the medium of instruction, Gandhi stated, this is a speech at Mahinda College, that's in down south in Gaul. Let me put the greatest stress upon the desirability of giving these boys instruction from A to Z through the Sinhalese language. I am certain that the children of the nation that receive instruction in a tongue other than their own commit suicide. It robs them of their birthright. Close quote. This is a speech in 1927. So let me just to look at the political situation at that time, the time of the Gandhi visit to Sri Lanka and the language politics during the 1930s. It is also worth noting that another key figure of Lanka's language politics, S.W.R.D. Bandaranayake, was an admirer of Gandhian policies. According to James Maynard, the biographer of S.W.R.D. Bandaranayake, the period between late 1930s and early 1933 can be seen as something of a Gandhian phase of Bandaranaike's career. So if you look at some of these interesting photographs, so this is, hope you can all see this screen. By May 1931, Bandaranaike had occasionally taken to embrace the most visible element of the Gandhian idiom, or the wearing of khadi. His monograph, the Bandaranaike's monograph on the spinning wheel and the paddy field, appeared in May 1933 and expressed the necessity of introducing a national regeneration in Lanka upon the Gandhian models India. As you can see these two photographs, this is young Bandaranaike, who became later Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. And this is the next picture is the famous photograph of the Gandhi. And this idea of an official language, or in Sri Lanka it was called Rajya Bhasha, became politically important question in the 1940s. During the same time in India, the question of national language, or the Rashtra Bhasha, there was a move by the Congress, Indian Congress Party, to declare Hindi only policy, and these ideas influenced the leaders of the Ceylon National Congress as well. It is interesting to note that Gandhian ideas and policies have played an important role in shaping the discourse of national language politics in pre-independent Sri Lanka. This is what I want to stress, that especially in the 1930s and 40s, there was a lot of Indian influence because of all these the Sri Lankan Congress leaders. The Ceylon National Congress leaders had very close links with the Ceylon National Congress. In 1939, a policy statement of the Ceylon National Congress stated, independence further connotes the abandonment of English as the official language and the adoption of national language. We suggest the adoption of Sinhalese, the language of the majority of the people, as the official language. These are from the documents of the Ceylon National Congress. This majoritarian consideration received a much needed endorsement from the example of neighboring India. So this is very interesting to note, this idea of one language. In India, the Hindi was being promoted as an official language with the aim of replacing English and as one official language, and it was intended to be the basis of national unity or the kind of linguistic unification in a multilingual society. And in 1940, a joint secretary of the Ceylon National Congress, J.R. Jayawardena, said, I quote from the documents of the Ceylon National Congress, this is part of my research in my doctoral work as well, politically too, we in Ceylon may have to take decisions looking to Allahabad, where Congress headquarters are, and not to London for an answer. Close quote. This is a document from Ceylon National Congress. Politically too, we in Ceylon may have to take decisions looking to Allahabad, where our Congress headquarters are, and not to London for an answer. Close quotes. So on the invitation of All India Congress Committee, delegation from Ceylon National Congress, including Jayawardena, who became President of Sri Lanka, the first executive president in 1978, attended the 53rd annual sessions of the Indian National Congress held in March in 1940 at Ramaga. In 1943, in the light of the general increase in the awareness of language issues, a resolution was brought to the consideration of the State Council seeking to establish Sinhala alone the official language. The mover of this resolution was J.R. Jayawardena, the Joint Secretary of the CNC and also a follower of Gandhism. So this is interesting. The two national figures who work for the national language policies in pre-independent Sri Lanka, both Bandaranaike and Jayawardena, they were followers or the admirers of Gandhi's ideas. The official rationale given by the Sinhalese politicians for the proposed adoption of Sinhala as the official language of Sri Lanka related to the situation in Sri Lanka to that of India. For example, in the 1944 debate, in his official language resolution to the State Council, Jayawardena said, I quote, we also have the example of India where the Indian National Congress had insisted that English should be supplanted from its position as the official language, that linguistic provinces should be created, and that Hindi should be the official language. So, commenting on 1944 again in the language resolution, the weekly newspaper of SWRD Bandaranaike, Sinhala Mahasabha, pointed out, I quote, out of population of some 6 million souls in Ceylon, 4 million are Sinhalese and their mother tongue is Sinhalese. Therefore, Sinhalese is the common language of this country. This is interesting, that idea of common language, where when they promoted Hindi as a common language for India. So therefore, the Sinhalese is the common language of this country, and those who live in this country should have the simple grace to accept this fact. So this is from a newspaper appeared in 1943. As this quotation shows, there was general opinion among the Sinhalese side about the state of Sinhala as a common language of the country. And speaking on this issue of language, another council member of the Kandyan seat of Matale, a Sinhalese member, contended that the fundamental condition for a national unity was a single national language or a common national language as envisaged by the leaders of the Indian National Congress. So influenced by the Indian nationalists, some of the Sinhalese leaders had emphasized the need for a common language or a one national language, promote national cohesion, but as all we know from the post-independent politics of Sri Lanka, the promotion of Sinhala for that cause created a problem. As I argue, it was the Gandhian view that was articulated as the common language for Sri Lanka. So in this context, the idea of one official language was not necessarily a post-independence phenomenon. As we know, in 1956, the Sinhala became the only official language. So this is not a post-independence kind of phenomenon. As we argue, the idea of common language was there even before the independence. The slogan of one official language had significant links and ideological connections with the Indian national language movement and also with the Gandhian idea of common language. So I would like to stop here, and I would be happy if you have any questions or any suggestions to on this presentation on Gandhi's ideas on language and its influence on language policy. These are few of my references for my presentation. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discuss this in further. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coperahewa. That was a illuminating presentation, really, on how Gandhi's views on a unified language influenced similar currents in Sri Lanka. I guess this points to us the risk of following, or sometimes the tension between following Gandhi in letter and Gandhi in spirit. We do say that we should follow Gandhi in letter and spirit, but sometimes the Gandhi's letter and Gandhi's spirit seem to contradict each other. And there was a point which we discussed yesterday about how Gandhi was unencumbered by executive office. And when Gandhi's followers come into executive office, many of the formulations of the nationalism project, of the ideology of nationalism almost, including the ideology of language, come to be problematic in actual office. In the same period you describe, in the late 1930s, between 35 and 40, roughly speaking, you had the provincial governments in many provinces in India, including in the Madras Presidency, under Rajaji, Dr. Rajagopalachari, who later became the Governor General of India, as you know. And Hindi was imposed as a compulsory language, and this led to the first anti-Hindi agitation in Sri Lanka, in Tamil Nadu, and then Hindi had to come on subsequently. So even Gandhi's closest disciples and most intimate followers grappled with these contradictions while in office. And what is strange today is that you can argue for a national language in India or anywhere using Gandhi, using Gandhi's works and his speeches in his time, which were well meant, of course. And you can argue for the rights of individual languages and linguistic groups also by invoking Gandhi, which again is one of those delicious ironies of history and of our time. But I'd like to stop there, and we have about 20 odd minutes. I'd like to throw this open to questions from the audience, from maybe discussants. The resource persons have questions of each other. Maybe Dr. Raghavan could come up with a few questions in his own way. Anybody else? If you could indicate that you want to answer the question or put it on the...
Hello.
Yes, Mr. Dr. Bandapad, please.
Can I ask the two brief questions?
Yes, please. Dr. Bandapad, please go ahead.
Yeah. My question is addressed to two speakers, Professor Raj Sekhar Basu and Dr. Coperahewa. To Raj Sekhar Basu, my question is this, that he finds a certain kind of parallel of scenario both in India as well as in Fiji, while discussing the situation of the labor movement. And he spoke about Baba Ramchandra, and then he came back to two very interesting propositions. One is the preponderance of the notion of Sitaram on the one hand, and another is the interference of Bandi Maharaj, just the opposite. Now, finally, he came back to take up the issues through the persons like Bushishta Muni and the interference of two other persons, Monilal and Jayakumar. My question is that in this process of change, how the image of Gandhi was built up, changed, modified, and finally remained with us? This is the question to Raj Sekhar. And to Dr. Coperahewa, my question is very brief. You know that there is similarities between the question of the national language in India as far as Hindi is concerned, as far as the time 1917 is concerned, and also Sri Lanka as far as the only Sinhalese question is coming up from the 1927 onward, but by the 1940s it is very much there. My question is that from the point of view of Gandhian viewpoints, how you know that there are so many languages and one lingua franca, one national language we are taking up, how the question of non-violence, actually non-violence in between the languages actually work here? These are the two questions.
Shall I answer for your question? Yes, I'm Coperahewa from Sri Lanka. Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for your question. And it's interesting to hear this, when I'm speaking for an Indian audience on the question of language, and there are many things to share, both to India and Sri Lanka. And there is non-violence, but compared to the Indian national language movement, the Sri Lanka's movement was basically a kind of is non-violent in the language issue. In 1930s, 40s, it was mainly on Subhasha at the beginning. There was no such violence on the question of language up to 1956, even 58. It was not a mainly in 58 the kind of the riots that had this was not only mainly on language, but it was mainly on the other issues. But as you correctly pointed out, there was no such kind of violence on the question of language, but there was some kind of Gandhian kind of ahimsa, which is satyagraha on the question on language. There was a lot of satyagraha movements or the protest on the question of language, especially when in 1956 the Tamils, there was a lot of satyagraha conducted by the Tamil people. So there was no such kind of violence on the question of language in Sri Lanka, but it's a bit different from the Indian side. There was no such kind of any kind of deaths or anything on the question on the national language movement. Hope I answered your question.
Thank you. We have a question from Dr. Papia Sengupta.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Good morning, all the esteemed speakers and colleagues and friends. I have a question and a comment for Dr. Coperahewa, because I also work on language. I think when we talk of when we are talking about Gandhi here, Gandhi was not actually, his ideas on national language, common language, unified language, and he uses these terms at times, synonymously. But, these were actually swinging. So we have to agree to it that at least this is my personal opinion of my reading in the past 15 years of Gandhi, that Gandhi's views on language changed. Okay, and it changed. He was experimenting with, this particular issue of language. So in the 1970s also, when, the Hindi Prachar Samiti was started and he becomes a member of it, and he goes to, Chennai and gives his lecture, and he speaks in Hindi, and he says that I should learn Tamil because otherwise, people don't understand me down south. But very soon, you have to also understand, he comes up with something known as, the Vardha education scheme. And, the Talim, Nai Talim. And he also changes this name of Hindi Pracharini Sabha to Hindustani Pracharini Sabha, seeing the religious, connotations which the language Hindi came up with, Hindi as identified only with the Sanskritized version, written in Devanagari. So when you are commenting, from 1917 and, so on and so forth, there is this particular quote where, and I'm quoting from, the 2nd May 1942, and this is actually, earlier, it was 27, but the book which I'm referring to is Gandhi on National Language, where Gandhi, and this is, I'm quoting, verbatim Gandhi, If the Hindi Sahitya Sammelan people insist that they will work only for Sanskrit-ridden Hindi, the Sammelan ceases to exist for me. The language of the villagers is one. It cannot be two. The Hindi people want me to boast Hindi and never mention a word of Urdu. But how can I, a satyagrahi with faith in non-violence, do such a thing? So I think, when we are talking about Gandhi, and specifically, I could only find, 5 books on Gandhi. I think a very important thing is his correspondence. If you actually go to the letters he is writing, when the Constituent Assembly is fighting on the language issue, and people are talking about Hindi in one go, Hindustani in the other way, and the southern states are talking about English as becoming the official language. Firstly, I think during the political situation, which is now very post-Gandhian, one needs to make a distinction between official language, national language. That is one thing. In India, because this is leading to a huge kind of confusion among people. It is leading to a kind of a feeling of majoritarianism. So a national language is different than, and I actually do not believe that, India talks about scheduled languages and not national languages. And this is there post 1956 when we have the language, fights, and, in specifically, after which, we, in India, we have the linguistic reorganization of states. So somehow, quoting Gandhi and talking about, Gandhi's views on one language, where, of course, it influenced, one language in Sinhalese in Sri Lanka. But at the same time, if I'm not wrong, about 5 years back, I was a part of Indo-Sri Lanka language meet. And there, the people, the delegates from Sri Lanka who came, they actually were talking about how India could balance, not only Hindi and the other regional languages. And Hindi is also just spoken by 42%. So it is also not a majority language, let me tell you that. And Hindi is a culmination of 27 different dialects. And I'm not going into the distinction between dialect and language, because again, that is very, very discriminating. So please, if you can, when you talk about this, I would really feel that, one uses the terminology with a bit of, and gives, the credit to Gandhi that he's also, he's also writing, and, what he has written when he's 35 changes when he's 60. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Coperahewa, would you like to respond?
Yes.
So I would mention that Dr. Arvind Gupta, on this lines also, he has asked a question.
Yes, I have a question from Arvind Gupta as well.
React to in the Gandhian ideas of national language.
Yes,
thank you, sir.
Yeah, I'll first answer to Dr. Sen Gupta. Yes, thank you very much, and for your very interesting comments. And I totally agree with you, Dr. Sen Gupta, because Gandhi's ideas on language was like changing. But as I mentioned, but I don't want to say, but Gandhi promoted kind of a common language, but he was in favor of kind of linguistic unification, kind of linguistic order for India, right? And what I want to stress is during these 1930s and 40s, the Ceylon National Congress leaders had very close link with India, especially with Allahabad and also with the other places. So they took this idea of kind of linguistic order from India and promoted Sinhalese as the common language. So that's what I want to say. Basically, even there are so many references, they quoted Gandhi in singular papers. So Gandhi promoted kind of this idea of Hindi, and they promoted Sinhalese in the Sri Lankan context. So this is very interesting, the links between the early politicians like Bandaranaike and Jayawardena. They all had very close links with the Indian, especially with the Gandhian, and also with one of these Indian Ceylon National Congress leaders. They visited most of these sessions in Indian Congress, and also with some other Gandhian kind of movements. So they had kind of links. So they thought this kind of a linguistic order, but in Sri Lanka is not a linguistic giant like India. So maybe the two main languages, the Sinhala and Tamil. So there's the two main languages. So there was a kind of a conflict competition between these two languages, and the politicians took this idea of linguistic order or the kind of linguistic unification, as the Sengupta correctly pointed out. This is debatable, the idea of national language. And also the Gandhi, when he's visited Jaffna, he promoted the mother tongue. That was what question from Dr. Arvind, Dr. Gupta, say, how did the Tamils in Sri Lanka react to Gandhian ideas of national language? But Gandhi didn't say much about the question on language, because when he was in 1927, it was mainly the question was on education, the mother tongue education. There was no such a national language question in 1927. So that there was no resistance from the Tamils in Sri Lanka, because this was mainly the Gandhi promoted kind of Swabhasha, both Sinhala and Tamil, for education. So this is it's a very kind of interesting kind of issue on the question of language, and I'm very happy to see the comments on this issue of language, and especially on the question of language and how Gandhi's ideas, the changing ideas on language. But the period I'm referring is in 1920s and 30s especially. But in 1944, when the question of language came to the State Council in 1944, was the time when Jayawardena promoted Sinhala as one language, and then in 1950s by Bandaranaike, right?
Thank you.
And sorry, there's another one question on how Gandhi's ideas are important for the youth of Sri Lanka. It's interesting that because it's from this question on the chat box, question how Gandhi's ideas are important for the youth of Sri Lanka. But in 1927, it was Jaffna Youth Congress, Handi Pilibranayagam. Jaffna Youth Congress was the main institution in Jaffna. There was an intellectual kind of a group in Jaffna. They are the people who invited Gandhi. Invitation came from the Jaffna Youth Congress. Most of the intellectuals and the Tamil scholars from Jaffna. So it interesting that there was a lot of influence of Gandhian ideas for Jaffna youth in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Dr. Coperahewa. Dr. Raghavan had a question and a comment.
Well, I would thank you very much, Chair. I firstly wanted to congratulate the two the speakers for the papers on Fiji and Burma, because they really give a different perspective on Mahatma Gandhi in Fiji, as his ideas being a kind of protagonist for a peasant movement. In Myanmar, a very strong identification with the underdog, which actually goes beyond thinking beyond national lines, and it develops further something which we had heard yesterday. On the language issue, and I think Dr. Sengupta already referred to this, that we can't view Mahatma Gandhi's ideas in a monochromatic frame, because what he felt about language or national language also has to be perceived, has to be seen in the context of his views on non-violence and imposition of ideas. I think he was very, very alive and very sensitive to the whole language issue, as all politicians in South Asia were at different points of time. We have an extreme example in the case of someone who is not sensitive to this issue, which is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, when he goes to East Pakistan and talks about Urdu, which is neither the majority language nor the language of a large part of Pakistan as it was constituted, being the national language. I think we have to see Mahatma Gandhi's views in a larger frame, and particularly in the context of the efforts he made to become a polyglot, no matter how inefficiently, but the efforts he made to learn different languages. There are many letters which he has signed in Tamil, for instance. So I think we have to take a broader view of his ideas on the language issue.
Thank you. I see one question from Mr. Sanjeev Kumar. Mr. Kumar, if you could ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, sir. My question is addressed to our speaker from Myanmar. He very rightly talked about Gandhi's 3 visits to Burma and his influence there. I would like to ask a question about Gandhi's conversation with top leaders of Burma. As we know, the Burmese leader, as we know, the Burmese leader UNO visited New Delhi in 1947 to meet Gandhiji. At that time, my precise question is whether the issue of Chinese revolution was discussed in any way. I am asking this question because Chinese sources have very well documented the conversation between Burmese leader and Chinese leader, especially Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and Chinese sources acknowledge that Prime Minister UNO has expressed his reservations about intentions of Chinese state when it emerged as a People's Republic of China on 1st October 1949. So my question is whether this issue or any other regional issue was discussed between Burmese leader, especially when Mr. UNO visited New Delhi. Thank you.
So, Mr. Maung Maung Oo, any broader regional foreign policy discussions between the leaders of Myanmar and Mahatma Gandhi? And I think that will be our final question. Yes, Dr. Maung, it's over to you.
Sir, I don't think he's logged in with us anymore. Okay. He has logged out.
Not with us. Dr. Raj Sekhar Basu, say something. You are muted, sir. You're muted. I think you are.
For raising this issue, because you know that several people during these days in 1920-21 in Eastern UP and Bihar were invoking the name of Rama and were using terms like Ramrajya and so on and so forth. And all these were connected to the sort of imageries of Gandhi and the sort
Have we lost him?
I think so, sir.
I think we've lost Dr. Basu.
He's connected.
His network is very poor.
But he's logged in. Is showing.
Professor Basu, can you listen to us?
Professor Basu, can you hear us? I think, Dr. Bandyopadhyay, your conversation with him will have to take place offline. We have a few more questions, but we've reached the end of our scheduled time. If I could once again thank all 3 of our speakers today, and if I could thank ICWA for inviting all of us for this very illuminating discussion. All 3 geographies, Fiji, Myanmar and Sri Lanka, taught us something different, but taught us something very relevant to the life and work of Mahatma and the interpretations and continued interpretations and reinterpretations of Mahatma Gandhi. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for participating. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for the discussion. I'd now like to hand you over to Dr. Bhattacharya and ICWA, who will take the seminar forward.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, panelists. And thank you, participants. We will now take a short break and will join back at 11:45 hours Indian Standard Time. Thank you again.
Thank you.